But so that I don't disappoint the person who took the liberty to copy and paste when they were preparing this program. I know they didn't type it out, I can guarantee you. They did not type it out. I can bet you my money. They did not type this national anthem out. They copied and they pasted it. They probably have missed a few sentences if they if they try to type it out. So maybe colleagues, just from a patriotic point of view, let us stand up and sing the national anthem. Tessa, I've seen you singing from time to time. I'm not sure if you are still able to do so. Geleli Afrika maluphakanyiswa pondolwa yo yizwa imithandazo yethu Nkosi sikelela thina lusapho lwayo wena buluka sitshaba saheso ufetise dintwale matswenyeho usibuluke sitshaba saheso sitshaba sa South Africa, South Africa. Die blauw van onze hemel, uit de diepte van ons je, waar ons je weggebergd is, waar de grenzen antwoord geeft. Sounds they call to come together, and united we shall stand. Let us live and strive for freedom in South Africa, our land. Thank you. You can clap for yourself. I'm still not sure why people clap after the national anthem. It's instinctive though. They just clap. Not sure what it means. Are they happy? They resonate with the national anthem. It's a nice national anthem because it's quite prayerful in what it calls for. But we all don't mean the same thing about these words in this national anthem. Morena buluga sitshaba saheso. But we keep doing all the wrong things and think that God will save us from wrongdoing. But it's very nice to see some people I have not seen in a very, very long time, some people that I have seen over the past year quite a lot, like Commissioner Janet Love. You know, Commissioner, what is beautiful about today is I can guarantee you there is no war today. Don't be... I see the group of the 70s is here, Outer is here, Rivonia Circle is here. Don't worry, there's no war today. Darrell is here from Cape Town, you know. They flew all the way to be here, but they are not fighting today, don't worry. The fight is with the president, not with the IEC. So you are in safe territory. But it's always good to come together and reflect on some of the insights that are there. You would swear that the only thing that is important is, you know, the economy because of the struggles and so on. And so people who tend to do democracy work, colleagues from the HSRC will know us in the humanities, we are always battling to keep funding because we are told that we are not part of the scarce skills or rare skills or in fashion skills, and yet without the humanities there is absolutely no basis for understanding society. And I say this as a failed engineer who became a humanities scholar. So sometimes people also think that we end up in the humanities because we don't know maths. So sometimes we just need to brag and remind them that in our day, it was also all in higher grade for some of us, and we got good marks and exemptions and all of the. We ended up in the humanities out of choice, not by force. We always get the residual rejects from engineering school, medical school, and once they reject you, there you run. And I do a BA here, and so on. But it's good to come together, listen to some research, particularly on the work that the IEC has been doing. I think, colleagues, the report is also in your packs. So you are more than welcome to read that report after the seminar, okay? So that you don't distract us by paging. I know the graphs are fascinating and so on. From a mathematics point of view, I can interpret the graphs for you. If you struggle, just tell me. There are a number of things that I think in the life of our research around elections are still missing, and I'm sure we will talk about some of those during the panel discussions. We've spent a lot of time over the years thinking about how best we do exit polling in South Africa. And I think some colleagues at the University of Johannesburg in 2019 tried to deploy on 5 sites researchers to try and do this sense of exit polling. Not a satisfaction kind of survey. We do a lot of that, which is almost a customer survey of sorts, but a substantive political exit polling. There are a number of things. I've been talking to colleagues at work to say, let's draw up a research proposal to understand the cohort of 18-year-olds to 24-year-olds, because that's the most undersubscribed cohort in terms of population cohorts, and just understand their politics, because we make a lot of assumptions. We say there's voter apathy. There's no voter apathy. They're just poor political choices. And people don't want, I said in the Sunday Times column this past weekend, people don't want to make decisions that they cannot defend in good conscience. Okay? You say, no, go vote. Person says, but there's nothing to vote for. Say, no, just choose. Just choose any. That's how some politicians here, I see we've got colleagues from the IFP, from Action SA, if I see any others. But that's how some of these political parties get votes. It's not because people are convinced and convicted about them. They are just choosing the better devil out of the many devils on the ballot. The IEC would know there is a bit of appetite amongst researchers to gain access to spoiled ballots in particular, just to see the patterns of spoiling the ballot. Is it really because there is illiteracy in terms of voting? Or are people making statements? Because some people spoil the ballot. They get there, they put Lukhona Mnguni at the bottom and they vote for Lukhona Mnguni. But Lukhona Mnguni is not contesting elections. But they just want to satisfy their patriotism that I showed up on election day, but I'm going to spoil the ballot. Sometimes it's a deliberate choice. So there are a lot of research things that we can think and deliberate about insofar as our elections are concerned. I don't want to talk about the electoral system because that one is a big fight, which it does not put in jeopardy the 2024 elections. I've heard this narrative. The Constitutional Court has already told us that they will never allow a situation where people extend their term of office unconstitutionally. So whether the current electoral amendment bill gets litigated on, we will litigate on it. I just want to be upfront about that. I know that colleagues disagree about this issue, but it would be an injustice to constitutionalism to frog march an unconstitutional bill and allow elections to happen under it. But that being said, there must be no anxiety about 2024 elections. There will be elections in 2024, whether or not you've got a constitutional confirmed amendment bill. The Constitutional Court told us in 2021, when the IEC tried through the Moseneke process to postpone elections, that it's not going to happen. And I think we must be very clear what we are solving for as we speak. So that also our conversations today are practical conversations with practical considerations about the future. There is a lot of anxiety about the IEC in terms of its funding that is decreasing. Maybe the IEC must tell us where we can drop 50 rands just to keep you in business, colleagues, because it's quite disheartening that the money for the IEC just keeps eroding. And as you would know, when budget is cut, it's not just money, it's a functional cut. So the IEC then has to make trade-offs. And people complain, where's voter education from the IEC? Where's research from the IEC? Where's voter registration? We're now faced with possibilities of only having one voter registration weekend, which really is something that galvanizes society towards, practicalities about voting and the polls. So we need to, I think all of us in this room, find a way to speak up and speak out against the funding cuts for the IEC. You can't be a constitutional democracy and you are continuously underfunding an institution that is the anchor and the pillar of your democracy, particularly given the added responsibilities for the IEC, such as doing the political party funding act management, which I know that the IEC did not prefer to do that, but the politicians saw it sound to do so. It's still a problem, but we can get there some other day. We've got to help the IEC to protect the vote, organize society to make sure, particularly as elections become more competitive, and there is a fear that there might be a coalition government nationally and in some provinces like Gauteng next year. So there has to be a lot of work done on how do we protect the vote, how do we include civil society, besides just the political parties. The political parties deploy their party agents and so on. For the first time in 2021, they were allowed into the auditing center of the IEC to do oversight. Those oversight processes need to be amplified as well. But anyway, let me call Mr. Thabo Masemula to come and give us a welcoming remarks. I've already made myself feel comfortable too much, Mr. Masemula, and usually we say, let us be welcomed first. I even took off my jacket. In isiXhosa we say, nikhulule idyasi zenu. Only then you can take off your jacket. But I always feel at home with the IEC. So please give us our welcome remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I stand before you to extend a warm welcome to you all. I first of all wish to acknowledge the presence of the Vice Chairperson of the Commission, Commissioner Janet Love. Commissioner, thank you very much for continuously supporting this province. Furthermore, I wish to acknowledge the presence of 5 provincial electoral officers from Limpopo, from the Eastern Cape, from Free State, from Northwest, and from Mpumalanga. I greatly appreciate your presence, POs. I wish to acknowledge the management team of the province of Gauteng and senior managers from National Office, particularly Dr. Rapo, who's actually the driver and the champion of research in the Electoral Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, I furthermore wish to extend a warm welcome to the HSRC team led by Dr. Ben Roberts. I wish to acknowledge him together with Mr. Mkhunu, Dr. Zondi, and Dr. Gordons. Welcome. We look forward to the presentation and the information with respect to the province of Gauteng. I wish to also extend a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists. Professor Derek Kotz, you are welcome, sir. Dr. Mbete, you are welcome. Ms. Tessa Dooms, you are welcome. I don't see my friend, Ibrahim Fakir, the friend of the Electoral Commission. You are hiding there in the corner. Welcome, Ibrahim. I wish to also extend a warm welcome to our sister organizations, the Chapter 9 institutions. I wish to acknowledge the presence of the HOD of Gauteng, Gauteng. Sir, we are welcome, Dr. Bartley. I wish to acknowledge the head of SALGA in Gauteng. Also my important stakeholders, the party liaison committee members who are present here, and political party leaders. I've seen some of the municipal managers who honored us with their presence, together with some city managers. They are welcome. I also wish to acknowledge the academia, intelligentsia, and opinion makers. I was made to believe that the student representative councils from some of the universities in Gauteng have joined this session. I also wish to welcome the municipal electoral officers that are always supporting all the electoral processes of the Electoral Commission. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of representatives of civic society, including faith-based organizations, NGOs that are here, traditional leaders, business, organized laborers, and other interest groups. I further wish to acknowledge members of the media, honored guests, and ladies and gentlemen. I should also recognize those that have joined us via the online platform. Program Director, allow me to make some few reflections and remarks. The first statement that I wish to make is the following, that competitive, regular, multi-party elections are important elements of any democratic system of government. The rights of citizens to freely choose their preferred candidates and political parties to represent them is the cornerstone of a democratic system. Imperatively, most importantly, it is important to have an impartial, competent election management body, such as the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission, in collaboration with the Human Science Research Council, has commissioned long-term flagship research studies in the following areas, and will receive the report this morning. They have covered these areas: voter participation surveys, election satisfaction surveys, South African social attitude surveys. Ladies and gentlemen, the Electoral Commission of South Africa prides itself on being an evidence-based election management body. The Electoral Commission places a strong emphasis on high-quality research to inform its operational planning. In discharging its constitutional and legislative mandate, the Electoral Commission considers scientific research as critical in all aspects of electoral democracy. These research reports, they influence the planning of all our electoral projects continuously. We believe that research reports will contribute in deepening and growing our democracy as a nation. In order for the IEC to be innovative and relevant, its decision-making process should be research-driven, Commissioner Love. The research reports that we are going to receive this morning contains key indicators which are important guidelines upon which the Commission bases its work in fulfillment of its constitutional obligation to deliver quality, credible, free and fair elections. The Commission is greatly encouraged by the findings that the IEC continues to be one of the most trusted institutions in South Africa. However, we remain concerned as an institution about the overall decline of the level of trust, especially in state institutions. Similarly, we should be concerned about the decline in voter participation. The Electoral Commission will continue to identify further opportunities for improvement, and the Electoral Commission is pleased that the focus of the research goes beyond the dynamics that place themselves on election day. Importantly, it includes a range of measures from the pre-election period to views and expressions of the registration procedures and the campaign period, just to mention a few. The research report, ladies and gentlemen, contains vital information that is important not only for the Electoral Commission, but for all our stakeholders. This report is useful for political parties, election contestants, researchers, opinion makers in the political environment. The Commission expresses its gratitude to the HSRC for an excellent body of work and to the South Africans for participating in these surveys. Distinguished guests, as I conclude, the Electoral Commission trusts that the engagements today will share more light on a number of inherent issues in the body of politics in the province of Gauteng, including voter turnouts in elections, the challenges that are confronting the Electoral Commission at the voting stations, the trust deficits that I've alluded to earlier in my opening remark. As I conclude, I hope that you'll find this research seminar edifying, insightful, informative, and engaging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Masemula, for those opening and welcome remarks. I see you did not give us too much permission, so we can't see people dancing on top of tables here, taking off their T-shirts and trying to intimidate us with their mikaba. Have you not seen these things at council meetings? Hey, politicians, you are in trouble today. I'm going to have a feast with you because you are not behaving properly. No. Hey, old people with their tummy out at a council chamber on top of tables. It was somewhere in KZN. During, I think, in a local municipality. So, my thing was, abantu bangakini, no, khuluma nabo. But thank you for those remarks. Colleagues, the power of research is always in it being utilized. You can have the best research, but if you don't utilize the lessons learned out of that research, it's meaningless. There is nothing that aches my heart as a researcher. You get commissioned to do a study, you put your time and energy in it, and the end user just simply receives it, and for them that's a KPI ticked. We did research on XYZ, and they take no lessons learned. They implement nothing from your recommendations. Okay, maybe they've paid you, you're fine, but it's not about money, it's about improving our institutions and how they function. So my other task today is to try, and we are now an hour out of time, but we will conclude at 1 p.m. So if I can take just 5 minutes from each speaker away, you will do me kindly. But I know that Commissioner Janet Love is not a person of many words. She's a person of many actions. So she's not going to disappoint me today by taking an hour. So why research is important to the Commission, Vice Chairperson of the Electoral Commission of South Africa. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Program Director. And also thanks to all of you who are here and to those who are online, taking time to engage with us and to help us to make use, in fact, of the research that has been done. I want to thank the province for the opportunity to be here and to be with you. Thank you, PO, also for all the warm words and all the introductions, because you've saved me some of that time that the Program Director is urging me to ensure that we make up. The idea of any institution continuing to do its work, continuing to follow a script, and not to reflect is something that can only bring problems. And I'm saying that because for us in the Commission, there is no election, and indeed there's no event, that is not also a learning experience. When we have one election, we leave that election knowing that we are going to have in-depth evaluations that take place within our regions, within our provinces, at the national level, in order to infuse our next planning process with the lessons that we've learned. And it's in this way that the evidence basis for how the Commission does its work has been so strongly established. And a second pillar of that evidence base is a pillar that calls upon external institutions with the necessary experience to really begin to assess different aspects of what we do from an independent standpoint in order, again, to give us the tools with which to do better. So the idea of research and its value is precisely to ensure that we can do better, and in that way to serve the nation better. But the idea of using that evidence, the idea of using those facts to make us better cannot be divorced from a process of engagement. And that is what today is about. It's to convey to you what the research has shown, but it's also to listen to you and to hopefully get from you as many ideas, as many proposals, as many suggestions as possible. Because again, if we were to think that we are so perfect that we don't need to hear other voices, it again would be a recipe for disaster. There is nothing that can be perfectly done, but what can be most imperfect is not to try and correct. So when we look at the research that has been done, and when we reflect on the years of research that have been pulled together, there are clearly challenges that as a commission we face, but also as a nation. And I think one of those key challenges is the issue of participation. The idea that one can have the vote is almost assumed that it's always been. There are not that many people who recognize the fact of being able to vote is an achievement. The fact of being able to vote is not as universal as it ought to be, and it's something that we need to protect. That idea of duty is something that is not as strong today as it was, and so participation as a sense of duty is not there. And maybe the clapping for, for our singing and our rendition of our national anthem is hopefully a sign not just of endorsement, but a sign of pride, a sign of support for our nation, because that is what brings about a sense of duty. But we can't take for granted that young people in particular are somehow born with that sense of pride and that sense of duty. It's not just an issue of education, it's also an issue of lived experience. And if lived experience is a lived experience that is around dissatisfaction and not a lived experience of doing some of the building on your own, of doing some of the work to make that community less of a rubbish dump than it ought to be, of being part of holding members of your own municipal councils responsible for doing the work for which they are paid. If that is not seen as part of what you bring to this country and it's only dissatisfaction as young people, then the idea of building, the idea of being part of something that you are making is of course going to be a lot more difficult. And so we need to recognize that when we look at the issue of participation, we are also looking at the issue of national pride, of an understanding and an appreciation and a real recognition of the need to protect the ideals of democracy, but it's also a problem of knowing that amongst our young people, we possibly do not have a sufficient amount of hope. Hope is the lifeblood of people's energy, and it may well be that our representatives need to be thinking about how they can instill in people a hope for the short term, a hope for the medium term, and a hope for the long term. And that's not just about broad statements. It's about very practical things that people can be part of, participate in, and also take hold of aspects of their lives. And when we're looking at what builds hope, it again is not just an educational issue. Education, of course, is important. It's the reality, the lived reality, the prospect of walking down a street that feels like something more, something better than a back alley sewer. It's like being able to feel safe as a woman and not to feel that one is always having to look over one's shoulder. These are very important parts of hope. But also, we need to have people who are inspirational. And some of those inspirational people are not necessarily politicians. Some of those inspirational people are teachers. Some of them are people who make vetkoek and support whole families for generations. We need to be able to appeal not just to our mainstream media, but to those who are the users of social media, to begin to cherish what is good, the people who bring us the hope, the people who can be those examples. Today you are going to hear a report of what kinds of feedback we have had over the years through the various surveys that the PO spoke about that have been undertaken in collaboration and with the really hard and consistent work of the HSRC, for which I need to just reiterate, are extremely grateful. But we haven't yet begun to see processes whereby other institutions, including the mainstream media, are having evaluations of what it is that they are bringing to this country by way of messaging. And I'm putting that out there just as an example to say there are other institutions as important as our own. The media is extremely important to be defended, to be protected. And I thank our program director for the words of encouragement to protect and defend the possibility for the Electoral Commission to do what it does do so well. And I'm saying the media is just as important. But my appeal to the media is to reflect, to get the data, to get the insights, in order to be able to up the possibility of what it is that you bring to our society, which is already valuable, but could be so much more so. In terms of one of the things that we need to figure out how we can do better is to make our people, and particularly young people, understand governance and understand the opportunities that do already exist. Some of them could be improved, to monitor what elected representatives are doing. We need to have ways in which there can be far more engagement. We need to have ways in which there can be far more accountability. And although it is extremely important, and it's possible, given the important members of your panel today, that you will hear some elements of issues to do with electoral systems, the importance of electoral systems cannot be underestimated. Whether or not you have constituencies, how you determine constituencies, whether or not you have only political parties or you have independents, all of these things are of critical importance. But what we do need to understand is that no electoral system, however innovative, no electoral system will solve the problem of accountability on its own. And do we give, through the media, through our education, through any of the outreach that any of you do, including civil society organizations who are present, faith-based organizations who are present, but also you who are political representatives, do we give our citizens the tools to know how to hold us accountable and how to engage? And if we don't give those tools, we are not fulfilling the possibility to encourage people to see the value of participation, not just in those decisions, but in the elections themselves. When the Electoral Commission is an institution that obtains a high level of trust relative to other state institutions, it does so primarily because it sticks to what our CEO sometimes refers to as the four corners of the law. We are guided by the law that is passed and debated and interrogated through the parliamentary and the processes of the legislatures of this country. And in doing that, we, as I say, use evidence base to really try and improve on an ongoing basis. But we are often, as a result of that, expected to do things at that level of high performance in a manner that is unsustainable. We are expected to pull every rabbit out of every hat. And elections and democracy can't be considered as rabbits. We have to understand that it is not the Commission alone that can shoulder the responsibility of ensuring civic and democracy education. We have to understand that it is not the Commission that can place before the citizens of this country, and particularly young people, appropriate candidates. It is not the job of the Electoral Commission. We have to understand that it is not the responsibility of the Electoral Commission alone to be able to take on the important challenge of engaging people to participate in elections and to fulfill what is ultimately one of the most important civic duties, to vote. So this institutional trust that is there is because we do everything we can to fulfill our obligations in terms of the law. We do everything to make it possible for people to register. We do everything to make it possible for people to understand how the voting will proceed, where it will proceed, and what will happen in a voting station. We try and work as much as possible with every kind of stakeholder, including stakeholders in the educational field, the faith-based field, higher education, in order to ensure that we do contribute to the civic and democracy education. But we cannot do it alone. We need to call on all of you. We need to call especially on our colleagues within the media to join us, to make this understanding of the importance of taking hold of society, of being part of a collective responsibility, to be the owners of your own destiny. We need to build that consciousness so people participate and people vote. I call on you all to really join us, to encourage people to register, for those of you who are in elected positions, to really take on board the fact that the citizens who put you in those positions, and even those who consciously, not because of ignorance in most cases, who consciously chose not to vote, are all looking at you, are all expecting of you to be the best of the leadership that this country can produce. You cannot disappoint people in a manner that spends time not looking at the concrete issues of delivery and then expect the next election to see an increase in participation. We need to work on this together, colleagues. We need to work on this together, compatriots. It's our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Janet Love, for that very specific call to everybody, and that indeed you can't only look to the IEC for solutions. In actual fact, I have little faith that the work of the IEC can improve participation. Generally, it's not designed for that. It's for all of us in society, as the Commissioner is saying, to boost this work. You know, last year in October, there was a by-election in Mthatha. And at the City Hall voting station, which is the most populous voting station in that particular ward in central Mthatha, voter turnout for the by-election was 3%. Okay? The IEC was there to run the election, make sure the infrastructure is available, but voter turnout was 3%. I want to suggest, Bob Mazibuko, that it's not the IEC that is going to increase that voter participation from 3% at that voting station. It's the behavior of politicians, it's the improvement. I mean, Mthatha has become a gangster city. People get shot at a shopping mall at 3 p.m. at the parking lot, okay? So when life is like that, does it encourage people to be patriotic, engaged, and all of these things. So it's quite an important call that the Commissioner is making for all of us to think specifically what is it that we can contribute in our own different ways. I'm getting some people registered to vote. That's my contribution, Commissioner. We are going to get the presentation. Colleagues, you are given an hour. Now, what I'm not going to tamper with is tea break, okay? I thought in my authoritarian behavior, I will cancel tea break. Hey, but I scanned the room and I realized, hey, there are people who have more youth in them than me. I won't say they are old. Say they have more youth in them, and therefore that tea break might be important to get some sugar and bites. So colleagues from the HSRC, I will give you about 50 minutes. So I went and I Googled because this country loves abbreviations. There is no place in the world that loves abbreviations like this country. Even Ibrahim, where he works, he goes by an abbreviation because he can't afford to say the full thing. It's too long. Ngaga. So I went and checked, what is this DCES? Thought maybe it's correctional services. You know, these days, we have a matter of Mangaung escape there. So I need people from correctional services just to private them. Tell us the truth. But no, they are from the division called Developmental, Developmental, Capable, Ethical State Division within the HSR. It sounds so nice. Like they can take our problems as a country away, these people. Developmental, capable, ethical, state, all these things that we want. They are a pipe dream sometimes. Okay, my other job is just to tell the truth, colleagues, sorry. Dr. Ben Roberts is going to lead the team with Mr. Ngapeli Mkhunu, Dr. Tobeka Zondi, and Dr. Stephen Gordon. Just colleagues, because I know that you are going to be presenting different sections, but please, man, just come here. You really dressed up, unlike me. You even put on a tie. Someone is wearing red. If it's red, maybe I'm colorblind. But let's admire you for the effort of waking up. And then I'll start with you, Dr. Roberts, to take us through this important report.
Thank you, Program Director. Hopefully I can take the jacket off as the day progresses and take your example. So Program Director, Commissioner Love, Mr. Masamula, and fellow POs, Dr. Rapu, and other members of MANCO, and indeed the IEC Gauteng office, panelists, as well as other stakeholders represented here in the room today, and indeed online. Thank you very much on behalf of my Executive Director, Professor Nanya Muller, and our HSRC research team for the opportunity to have this engagement, as Commissioner Love has said, have this engagement about research, use the research as a basis for talking about, having an earnest conversation about where we are as a province, as a country, and the kind of ideas that might need to come through from multiple stakeholders about how we might promote change. So I'm just going to ask my colleagues to load up the presentation, please. And the clicker. Where's the clicker gone? Okay, thanks. Someone took away the remote, so I don't know if it's floating around. It was with the other podium, but I think they took the podium away. Okay. If someone could just bring the remote. Thank you. Thanks very much. I think it's important to state up front that the Electoral Commission, and we've heard the inputs today from the PO, from the Commissioner, about the relative importance placed on a broad program of research. So indeed, the Electoral Commission as an election management body is indeed first and foremost a research-driven one. And since the late 90s, the Electoral Commission has partnered with the Human Sciences Research Council to undertake a program of electoral research with a particular emphasis on survey-based research, representative survey research, but also in particular also other qualitative work as well. Two particular surveys are of note in this regard. The first one we call the Voter Participation Survey series. It monitors electoral predispositions, usually 6 months or so ahead of each national and provincial election as well as local government election. So it's over time, it's showing increasing trends and tendencies amongst the voting age population around their attitudes, preferences, behaviors. The second survey series we've branded the Election Satisfaction Survey series. Indeed, as the program director said, it's not an exit poll. It is what the name says. It's an election satisfaction survey. It's the views of voters and their particular evaluations of different aspects of the election experience, both leading up to election day and the electoral process itself. So that series, again, also has a long history, and about 120,000 voters on election day have been surveyed through that series to date. As indicated, we're here to talk particularly about the launch of a new knowledge product. It's called the Election Indicators Report Series. It's been modeled to some degree on DPME's Development Indicators Report Series. So it doesn't represent all the possible indicators we collect. It's a subset of them that we think are important for monitoring and evaluation purposes. Just to say also, and this is particularly a demand that came from the Commission itself, typically in our post-election debriefing series, we'd focus on the big picture storylines coming from each round of surveying. There's a real increasing appetite for provincially referenced survey evidence as well. So part of this is doing national as well as provincial reports, and in those provincial reports, and you've got copies on the desk for those that are here in person, and online it is downloadable off the Commission's website. And they are really focused on benchmarking a particular province against the national average and against other provinces as well. By way of democratic context, I think we need to not look at these results in a vacuum. It's really important to look at the ongoing debate that's been occurring around the trends, the quality, the performance of democracy at large, and indeed reflecting on mounting public discontent that seems to have come through, and the differential bearings that it may have on political legitimacy as well as ultimately political behavior as well. And it really is about engaging with changing patterns of electoral norms as well as the much discussed aspects of active citizenship. In the last 50 years, democracy has accomplished one of the big successes. Samuel Huntington, the political scientist, talked that between 1974 and 1990, 30 countries transitioned to democracy in what's been branded the third wave of democracy. And between 1974 and 1976, the number of democracies in the world either increased or remained steady, However, since then, the world has been in a mild but protracted democratic recession, as has been pointed out by various scholars such as Larry Diamond. In the 90s and early 2000s, there was prevailing optimism about the trajectory of democracy. But we've seen a fundamental shift occur since the mid-2000s, where there's been a fundamental period of global democratic recession. Freedom House, which monitors democratic patterns year on year, has shown that we've had at least 16 years of consecutive decline in democratic tendencies. In the last 5 or 6 years or so, they've particularly focused on the deterioration of democratic norms and institutions and the discussion around the rise in authoritarian tendencies in certain countries around the world. So that's provoking a new concern. Are we starting to see the move away from just periodic patterns of democratic recession to perhaps even a gathering crisis of liberal democracy? And a lot of democracy scholars are weighing in on this in the last couple of years. Which brings us back to the South African context. I've talked about the surveys. I'm not going to wade into much methodological detail. Just to say that the first of the series that I mentioned, the pre-election voter participation survey series, really is intended to provide information on the views and behavioral preferences of adult South Africans, particularly for the Commission to better understand the broad electoral context, and to inform the Commission in its electoral management mandate and final preparations for the forthcoming electoral process. The mechanism for administering this is the HSRC's public opinion research infrastructure called the South African Social Attitude Survey. It's been running for about 20 years, but builds on earlier representative survey series that the HSRC has also been conducting. It's designed to be representative of the public 16 years and older, living in private households around the country, all the provinces. It's also designed to be provincially representative, important for today's proceedings. A random sample of areas is selected each year, and within those we go to approximately 3,500 addresses. We then collect face-to-face interviewing with a random sample in those sampled areas, as I said, usually 6 to 8 months ahead of election day. And then the data is weighted to the latest Stats SA's mid-year population estimates. The other series, the election day survey or election satisfaction survey series, its focus is on determining perceptions of voters regarding the freeness and fairness of the electoral process, and to assess the operational efficiency of the Commission in managing elections. The part of these results are actually referred to in the official declaration of each election that occurs in the final declaration. So some of the results are referred to, so it gives a public voice to views around freeness, fairness, and operational efficiency. The sample is again representative. We draw from a random sample of voting stations around the country, and we do interviews throughout the course of election day, 50 at each voting station we sample, and again, that's weighted to the national figures. Just want to touch, I know it's heavy this time of the day, but just talk briefly at the conceptual level. The 2 aspects to the way we've conceptualized the report that's in front of you. The first is on it relates to the increasing focus on electoral integrity. And this is a concept that's gained growth in the last 10, 15 years or so. And really the emphasis is on assessing the quality of elections over time. So evaluating different election management structures, processes, and the approach to electoral integrity adopts a positive human rights framing in which integrity is achieved when the electoral procedures meet established norms and standards at each of the stages in the election cycle that's represented in that graphic. So that's from the pre-election period through to campaigning, through to election day, and the immediate post-election period. The second part of the conceptual framing draws fundamentally on classic models of democratic support that actually dates way back to the 1950s, 1960s. And that's, over time been refined to some degree. So really the scope of analysis in this regard is to assess people's attachment to democratic values and principles at the broadest level, and that's what Commissioner Love was talking about, that sense of civic pride. Testing opinion on the performance of government and other political institutions, investigating attitudes to electoral participation and other political activities, and also looking at particularly subnational differences. So in the kind of deeper analysis we do, even beyond what's on your table today, we look beyond just provincial variation. We look at a range on a whole set of socio-demographic, economic, and other factors to really give a nuanced perspective on each of these core indicators of focus. So just to say that, and my colleague Ngapeli will talk particularly to this in showcasing the results, is we go from the broadest level, these warm, fuzzy feelings of pride, through to attachment to core democratic values and principles, through to evaluations of democratic performance in different aspects, through to that critical factor around trust in democratic institutions, and at the most specific level is obviously approval of office holders and their performance. So that's the kind of broader contextual approach that we've looked before moving into the electoral integrity evaluations across different aspects. Just because I know the program director accepted with his engineering background, I think a lot of us struggle with a barrage of figures in a short space of time. And I just want to indicate that the report, we've tried to, in each of the particular indicators we've chosen, to distill as much evidence as we can into each graph. So I just wanted to flag that you'll see quite a few of these kind of graphs in what my colleagues will present. Just to say there are a few things. Firstly, the provincial trend will be the one that's in a yellowish line, and that will be superimposed against the national trend line, which will be a gray line. So you'll get to be able to say, how does, for instance, Gauteng, in what way is it similar or different from the national average? And the second set is we've put what we call upper and lower bounds to provide a bit of comparative performance against other provinces. So the upper green line is the upper bound. That one really shows that the highest provincial measure or provincial value in every given year of surveying that we've done. And the dotted red line will show the lowest provincial value in that year. They're not necessarily the same provinces in each round, but just gives you a sense of the upper and lower range on each particular measure, whether it's pride or satisfaction with democracy, etc. So you give a sense, is Gauteng close to the bottom? Is it about average, or is it ranking pretty highly on any particular measure, and how is it swinging over time? So it's just a simple way of summarizing a lot of information. So with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Ngapeli to take us forward through some of the results.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Ngapeli Mkhunu. I am from the Human Sciences Research Council. I'd like to acknowledge all the dignitaries, all the PEOs, commissioners, and my executive director, as well as the program director. Could we please load up the presentation? Yes, so the first slide that I'll be presenting before you speaks to national pride, a matter that Dr. Roberts has spoken about briefly. National pride becomes particularly important in a democratic setting because it is able to tell or inform us how do citizens feel about being part of their country. So what we've seen in our research when looking at the province of Gauteng is that whilst national pride was initially high in the first 10 years of our democratic dispensation, as you could see in 2005 is at 91%, there has been a gradual decline over time in national pride. For example, the decade between 2008 and 2018, it fluctuates between 81% and 71%, before dipping to slightly less than 3/4 at 68% as of 2021. And 2022 figures resemble a similar picture as well. Now, as a democratic state, we must be able to evaluate whether or not democracy is still the preferred form of political regime in our country. And we do that by assessing the type of support that democracy as a whole in its entirety has garnered from ordinary citizens across the country, more specifically for this presentation for the province of Gauteng. What we found is that despite democracy still being viewed as the most preferable form of government, there has been a fluctuation over time. It has fluctuated between a high of nearly 2/3, 67%, down to about 33%. We are also unfortunately finding that there has been an increase in the fatalists, those who are of the view that whether or not the political regime we have truly doesn't matter. That is slightly less than 1/4. And we are also seeing that more and more citizens have indicated preference for a non-democratic regime. This continues as well. The trend holds even in 2022. We've already assessed whether or not democracy is still preferable. We then look at satisfaction with democracy. So how satisfied are our citizens with how democracy is working for them? We do not define what democracy is, we just ask them how is democracy working for them at a personal level. And we found is that within the province of Gauteng, satisfaction with democracy has unfortunately decreased over time. This is a picture that is quite similar as well to the national one. As you can see with the gray graph, the national picture shows that satisfaction with democracy has been decreasing. And despite early fluctuations in the late 2000s, it has ultimately dipped to 21% as of 2021, which is quite lower than the national average. We also then look to assess or measure living standards. We ask our respondents whether or not standards of living have improved or gotten worse for them as and their families and their respective communities. What we found, for example, with the province of Gauteng is that less than a quarter of our respondents indicated that they were, their living conditions or living standards were improving. Only 20% indicated that they were improving for themselves and their families, while as more than half, at 51%, indicated that it had in fact gotten worse. We also see that there is unfortunately an indication of dissatisfaction with the living standards when looking at the community. So only 13% of the respondents had indicated that life had improved for the community, while as more than half, at 57%, indicated that life had in fact gotten worse for the community. So the general sense is that citizens of Gauteng believe that not only has life gotten worse for the individual and family, it has also gotten worse for the community at large. We then looked at the retrospective and prospective change, looking at 5 key measures which are closely associated with living standards. Here we have service delivery provisions, crime and safety, unemployment, cost of living, and corruption. We looked at it retrospectively and from a prospective standpoint, so in the future. When looking at the living standards in the last 5 years, it paints a pretty grim picture because as we can see, for example, when looking at the unemployment figures, only 8% of Gauteng participants indicated that employment had improved in South Africa. While as when looking at the cost of living, only 10% had indicated that there was an improvement. And in all indicators except one, more than 3/4 of the surveyed respondents indicated that life had in fact gotten worse relative to these core indicators and measures. When looking at the future, the picture is even more grim, because as we can see, for example, crime and safety, only 14% of the respondents indicated that crime and safety or efforts of fighting crime had improved, while as only 14% had said it would improve for unemployment and 15% for the cost of living. And similar to the last 5 years, when looking at the next 5 years, mostly well over 2/3 of the respondents indicated that life would in fact get worse over time. We then, of course, looked at institutional trust in core political institutions. For the purposes of the study, we focused on national government, parliament, and local government. We found that overall there has been a decline in the trust in core political institutions, more specifically national government and parliament for Gauteng. As you can see, for example, in 2009, trust in national government was close to 70% in the province, but it has since declined to less than 30% as of 2021, and it continues to decline as of our 2022 analysis. The same is applicable as well for parliament, and as you can see with the gray graph, the Gauteng graph is consistently below, meaning that trust is dipping at a much more rapid rate within the province of Gauteng than it is at the national level. And of course, local government, we all know its importance as a sphere closest to our residents in terms of service delivery provisions. It has continued to decline over time as well. For example, in 2009, it was at close to 50%, but it has since declined to less than 20% as of 2021. We also look at trust in the Electoral Commission as an important Chapter 9 institution, and we have found that over time, trust in the Commission has also declined. For example, in 2005, trust in the Commission was at nearly 3/4, which is 72%, but it has since declined. As of 2014, it was at 44%, and it continues to decline. However, in studying the core political institutions such as the Commission, we find that there is a pull-down effect. The pull-down effect is effectively caused or establishes the relationship between satisfaction with democracy and trust in core in Chapter 9 institutions. So if one is satisfied with how democracy is working, they are far more likely to express trust in the Electoral Commission, and the inverse is applicable. If one is highly dissatisfied with how democracy is working, they are more likely to show a level of distrust on the Commission. We then, of course, assess a duty to vote. The duty to vote becomes particularly important because we always want to encourage citizens to vote. However, are we seeing that duty from a citizen standpoint? And unfortunately, I do not have good news to share in this regard. We are seeing that citizens are quickly losing their sense of duty or civic duty to vote here in Gauteng. So, for example, in 2006, it was over 80% and 83% who indicated that there is a strong duty to vote. This had dipped to about less than 2/3 in 2016 at 65%, and it continues to decrease as of 2021. It was at 61%. So citizens are losing the sense of duty to vote. We also now looked at internal political efficacy. The internal political efficacy basically establishes whether or not one's vote makes a difference. We are finding that more and more voters, participants are disagreeing with this notion. So, for example, in 2004, 70% of voters disagreed that their vote does not, in fact, make a difference. And as of 2021, that figure was at 35%. So the big takeaway here is that more and more people are starting to believe that, in fact, their vote does not make a difference. When looking at political efficacy, which is basically characterized as the critical determinants and intention to vote, we find that more and more citizens seem to be of the view that voting is meaningless predominantly or primarily because politicians cannot be trusted. So in 2003, 65% of voters disagreed with this view. However, as of 2021, 37% disagreed with this view. So the lesser the number of people who disagree, it simply means that the negative sentiments that politicians cannot be trusted, thus making voting meaningless, is increasing. We then looked at attitudes towards protest action. Many deem South Africa as the protest capital of the world, so we figured it would be prudent to look at whether or not protest action is viewed favorably in relation to electoral participation. So the first graph on my left looks at whether or not one agrees or disagrees with the notion that protesting in the streets is far more effective than voting. We found that 46%, slightly less than half of our voters, agree with this notion that protesting is far more effective than voting, compared to 34%. However, what we have found is that whilst there does seem to be an inclination or bias towards protest action, the majority of our participants, of 54%, disagreed with the notion that it's okay for participants to protest outside voting stations, for example, if they're unhappy with their municipality. And an overwhelming majority, at 72%, also disagreed with the vandalism of voting stations if they're unhappy with the performances of their respective municipalities. So while there is a slight bias towards protest action, it is not necessarily endorsed in terms of violent protest and vandalism. We then I'll now take you through voter registration and turnout intentions in the province of Gauteng. What we found in the province of Gauteng is that generally the province tends to have a high number of registered voters, and this increases over time. However, due to the dense population, the province has a lower share of voting age public that is in fact registered. Hence, you see it's only at 53.6% within the province. So this simply means that despite there being more people who are registered to vote, there are far more who are not registered to vote when considering the entire population that is eligible to register. We also then looked at voting attitudes and the perceived ease of the registration process. So we asked how many minutes did it take for voters to register to vote on average, and what we found is that it has been steadily decreasing over time, meaning it's becoming quicker and quicker to register to vote. So for example, in 2005, between 2005 and 2008, it was about 20 minutes or so. However, as of 2018, it was less than 10 minutes. So it's becoming quicker and quicker in terms of minutes for one to register to vote. And the perceived ease of registration, the vast majority of Gauteng residents seem to agree that registering to vote is either easy or very easy. And as we can see with the yellow Gauteng graph, it is far more higher in Gauteng than it is in the rest of the country. Of course, one of the key topics that have been highlighted and discussed has to do with online registration, particularly for the youth. So we tried to measure whether or not there is public support for online registration. And what we found is that the vast majority of our surveyed respondents agree that online voting would in fact make registration easier and far more effective at 65% compared to 15% who disagreed. And also, people said this should be continued beyond COVID. At 57% of our respondents who indicated that even beyond COVID, we should continue online registration. However, what is worth noting here is that despite the endorsement of electronic registration, there are concerns with potential electoral fraud, which may result from electronic registration. So 55% of our respondents cited potential concerns with electoral fraud, which may emanate from online registration processes. We then looked at our voting intention. So we asked our respondents, should there be an election tomorrow, would you come out and vote? And what we found is that there was a much higher sentiment of those who would vote tomorrow should there be an election in the early 2000s. For example, in 2006, this figure stood at nearly 3/4, 71%. However, it has continued to decrease over time, and as of 2021, it was at 63%, and it continues to decrease as well as in 2022. I'm now going to take you through the voter turnout in terms of percentage of registered voters within the province of Gauteng. And what we are finding here within the province of Gauteng is that turnout in terms of the local government election is slightly lower when compared to the national average. As you can see, the yellow graph is below the gray national graph. However, for the national and provincial elections, turnout in Gauteng is consistently one of the highest across the country. As you can see, from 2009 all the way to the 2019 NPEs, the number of voters who turn up in Gauteng far exceeds those who turn out at the national level or when compared to the national level. Now, of course, we then ask our respondents what are the predominant or foremost reasons they've provided as to why they would not vote. So we did a comparison of almost a decade apart between 2010 and 2021. And for example, in 2010, we found that there was only a 4% difference between the rest of the country and Gauteng in terms of the reasons that have been provided for not voting, which is disillusionment in politics. So in 2010, this figure stood at 62% for Gauteng compared to 58% for the rest of the country. However, in 2021, we've established that disillusionment has grown far rapidly within the province of Gauteng than it has for the rest of the country. So there is about a 13-point differential between Gauteng and the rest of the country in terms of voters who are more disillusioned or who've cited disillusionment as the predominant reason for as to why they would not participate in an election if there were to be a national election tomorrow. Part of that, part of the process included us trying to understand and get a better understanding of how citizens would respond to unfulfilled expectations, particularly in Gauteng. So if the party you voted for did not meet your expectation, what would you do next time there is an election? So the big takeaway from this slide is that even within Gauteng, loyalty is the foremost dominant response. However, it is far less than the rest of the country. So, for example, in the rest of the country, 43% of the respondents said they would, in fact, give the political party another chance, compared to 31% in Gauteng. We also, however, found that abstention is quite similar when looking at the province of Gauteng and the rest of the country. But what is most interesting to note is that swing voting in the province of Gauteng is far more common than the rest of the country. So only 12% of respondents across the country said they'll vote for another party, and this is compared to 23% in Gauteng. So there's a greater likelihood of one swing voting if they reside in the province of Gauteng. I'll now take you through some of our campaign integrity results. These results are gathered from the VPS, which means it's a pre-electoral experience. It's based on perceptions. It's not necessarily a reflection of voters' experience on election day. So we asked our respondents whether or not they're of the view that some people receive cash, gifts, or services for their vote. And slightly less than two-thirds of the Gauteng population, at 67%, indicated that they were of the view that some people did receive cash, gifts, or services for their votes. So what this speaks to is that there is a far greater cynical view of voting processes within the province. This also holds similar as well when looking at whether or not voters are bribed. 66% of our surveyed respondents indicated that they believe that voters are in fact bribed. And this is amongst the highest in the country, with the highest being the Northern Cape, then followed by Gauteng. We also looked at the perceived campaign integrity, again sourced from the perceptions in terms of the voting, in terms of the VPS. This is not necessarily a reflection of the voting day experience of voters. So we asked our respondents, do they believe that rich people buy elections, and whether or not our respondents agree or strongly agree with that sentiment. More than half, at 51%, agreed that rich people do in fact buy elections. And when looking at electoral coverage from a journalist standpoint, we found that over 58% of our respondents agreed with the notion that journalists do not provide fair coverage of elections. This is second highest following the province of the Northern Cape. We then look to assess whether or not our respondents' views when it comes to political party tolerance, more especially during campaigns. So we asked our respondents, did political parties and candidates demonstrate tolerance during the campaign period? We found that the vast majority of our respondents indicated that parties were quite tolerant with one another. However, there are some exceptions. For example, the white population group indicated that they are more likely to view party conduct as being intolerant. And respondents who would be deemed as less educated were less likely to view conduct as intolerant. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Zondi. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. A special greetings to all the stakeholders gathered here today. My name is Utobega Zondi. I am from the Human Sciences Research Council, and I'm based in the KZN office. I'll be taking you through voter education, actually the better half of this presentation. So here we are looking at the number of civic and democracy education events in GP in the financial year, and there were 6,856, and this translates into 59 0.9 events per 100,000 of the voting age population. So GP is slightly lower than the national average with its reach to CDE events. So the IEC needs to be very mindful of this. And then when we're looking at the voting information, so the level of information that citizens have on voting. So the question asked here is, do you think you have too little or too much information about how to vote? So the young voters are more likely to have enough information, and the less educated voters are less likely to have a lot of information about voting. And the province demands for more information if you look the trend over time. When we are looking at the sources of voting information, so the objective here was to determine the main voting information sources used by the public. And as we can see, television, radio, newspaper, and poster, your traditional forms of media sources are being used. And in terms of the perceived usefulness of the differences of sources of voter education, so most of the adult public in Gauteng said that the traditional broadcast media, your radio, television, etc., was useful. And there's also a growing popularity of the Election Commission websites in the GP province. If we look at the perceived effectiveness of voter education campaigns, so here, how effective was the IEC's voter education campaign for these elections? So young voters are more likely to view the campaign as effective, and then as we dig deeper in our analysis, we found that colored voters are more likely to have the view that the campaign as effective. So I'll be taking you through the voting experiences of voters. So here we are looking at the time to get to the voting station, so determining the average time taken to get to voting stations. The goal here was to determine the average time that has been taken. So we can see there's an average time of 12 minutes that it took voters in GP to get to their voting station. It has definitely improved over time. It's actually dropping. It was 23 in 1999 and now 12 minutes. And the time taken to reach one's voting station in the province, you can say that it has remained stable. When you look at the queuing time, so determining the average queuing time at voting stations, we asked participants, how long did you queue before voting? So between 1999 and 2021, the average length of time voters spent queuing in the province was 14 minutes. When looking at the accessibility of voting stations of voters with special needs in the GP province, the question here was, how easily accessible was the voting station to persons with disabilities or the elderly? The proportion of GP voters who felt that voting stations were accessible to persons with disability was high in all survey rounds. However, we are seeing a decline. So the IEC needs to be very careful here. Something is definitely happening. So when looking at the voting procedure in the voting station, how easy it was to understand. So we're assessing how voting procedure was perceived. So when examining the public opinion on the user experience of voting procedures in TP between 1999 and 2021, a largely positive picture emerges. So over this period, the vast majority of voters in the province found the voting procedures inside the voting station easy to understand. When looking at the conduct of electoral officials, there was a relatively little change in most evaluations over time. The proportion of voters who viewed officials as impartial has declined since 2009. The better educated citizens are more negative about impartiality. When assessing the safety and secrecy of the vote at voting stations, the majority, which is 88% of voters in GP, had faith in the arrangements made by the voting stations to ensure the secrecy of their votes, and nearly all, 95% of the voters in GP, had faith in the arrangements made by voting stations to ensure the secrecy of their votes. in 2021. When we look at the satisfaction and ease of use of the ballot paper, a considerable majority, 67% of voters in GP, were very satisfied with the ballot papers used in the national and provincial elections in 2019. This demonstrates that overall voters are fairly pleased with the ballot paper design. Majority, 71% of voters in GP, said it was easy finding the party of choice on the ballot. When looking at the perceived electoral freeness in GP, an overwhelming majority of voters in 2021 elections, 92%, felt that the election procedures were free. A further 3% said they were free with minor problems, and 2% said they were not free at all. So resolutely positive, especially compared to the LGE in 2016, when only 89% rated the election as completely free. When looking at the perceived electoral fairness in the GP province, a similar share, 92%, rated the election procedures as unconditionally fair in 2021, with 2% indicating that the elections were fair apart from minor problems. So marginally lower perceptions of electoral fairness in 2021 than 2014, 2016, and 2019. I will then hand over to Dr. Stephen Gordon, who will take us through conclusions and what does this mean for us. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, excellent. Well, I have been given the enviable task of concluding the HSRC seminar, presentation on electoral attitudes, attitudes towards democracy, and attitudes towards voting. Now, I think we can all appreciate, having listened to my colleagues brilliantly and with great clarity outline how trends have changed over time, the value of public opinion data, and truly the tribute to the IEC for investing in this research architecture. Not only is the research architecture available to South Africa, one of the best in the African continent, is indeed one of the best in the world. Sustained investment over many years has allowed us to acquire a level of data and sophistication unrivaled throughout the world. We are able to, as my colleagues have brilliantly shown, to analyze meaningfully trends over time. Indeed, the data presented here today is but the tip of a very large iceberg. Very detailed and comprehensive subgroup analysis can be conducted to really reach in and understand the pivotal and meaningful changes that we have seen over the last 2 decades. So if we could just have the presentation up, that would be fantastic. Now, obviously my colleagues have shown that fundamentally we are in one of the harshest political moods we have seen in South Africa in 20 years. Satisfaction in democracy is low, trust in government is low, there is deep concern over the effectiveness and utility of electoral participation. And I'm just going to go back. There we go. Now, luckily, Gauteng fares a little better than some other provinces, including my home province of KwaZulu-Natal. Right? Indeed, compared to other provinces, turnout in national and provincial government elections is quite high, and indeed, on certain measures, we can see that the province is doing well, but this relative edge should not lead us into a false sense of security. The overall trend shows that electoral attitudes, faith in democracy, faith in elections, are beginning to decline. Indeed, with 2021 being some of the lowest evaluations that we have recorded in more than 20 years. Indeed, 2022 data, which my colleague alluded to earlier, although at a preliminary stage, shows a continuation of this trend. What should worry us most is the diminishing of political efficacy. Because if people lose that feeling that voting matters, that voting will achieve meaningful results, then they are less likely to turn out for elections. We saw that political disillusionment remains the core reason given for not participating in elections. We saw that electoral participation is declining. We also saw a growing polarization between those people who actually turn up to the polls, who tended to be very contented with the democratic process because they are exposed to the good work of the IEC, they're exposed to an effective electoral management body, and those disillusioned non-voters who stay home, who become very, very skeptical, very doubtful, very cynical about democracy, and very cynical and doubtful about the Election Commission. Indeed, this is one of the reasons we see a decline in trust in the Election Commission, people losing faith in democratic institutions, losing faith in the democratic process, this bringing down, pulling down faith in the Election Commission and the good work that it is doing. Now, as Janet Love, who opened the proceedings here today, has alluded to, what voters and the general public want is greater accountability. If we ask them about what is the most important democratic value in South Africa, issues around accountability, listening to voters, listening to citizens, always emerges near the top. The danger that we have seen is that this demand for accountability, this unmet desire for accountability, may lead to negativity, a negativism, a cynicism that spills over into certain fatalism about democracy, a loss of faith in democratic ideals. Now, one of the buffers against such a slide into negativism is civic duty. The civic duty to participate in elections, the civic duty to turn out to vote, right? And that has acted for many years as a kind of barrier, wall, a buffer, preventing people from abandoning the electoral process altogether. But what we've seen is a decline in that sense of civic duty. South Africa has for many years, despite being unhappy with politics, distrusting national government, had a strong civic duty to turn out to vote. We had much higher levels of electoral participation than many other countries throughout the world. But as we've seen today, that is declining. So, if the results that we have seen today maintain their course, if nothing dramatic happens between now and 2024, we should see a low turnout scenario, right? The low turnout we observed in 2021, LGE, should turn out for low turnout in 2024, NPE, right? Obviously, no one can predict the future. There's a lot of time between then and now, but the trends persist. That's what we will see. So what do we need to do to change this low turnout scenario and restore faith, right? To empower disaffected Democrats to feel that they should participate in the process. And particularly here, the South African youth, which we all know are not registering to vote, and therefore when it comes to elections, are not turning out to vote. Right? Why are they disengaging from politics? And we provided some very, very good answers here in this presentation. Right? It's very, very clear in the reports in front of you. There's even more data on these issues. So what can we do? Well, there's a series of things we can do from a technical level. Right? So online registration has been very successful. It's highly approved by the general population. This needs to continue. Obviously, there are safeguards against fraud, and these safeguards need to be popularized to put people's minds at ease. Right? Balloting education is definitely going to be an issue going forward. The rise of independent candidates may create an issue in which it's harder to find people on the ballots, although right now, people are very satisfied with the good work the Election Commission has done in terms of the ballot paper. This is potentially an issue of future concern. But mainly, the main thing that we need to do is stronger civic messaging. Right? Communicating about the duty to vote, the power of voting, and to use one's vote to ensure that your voice is represented in the democratic process. Right? We need to address this growing disillusionment. past public opinion research has shown that once you lose faith in a democratic system, in democratic participation, it's very hard to get that faith back. And you get trapped in a low turnout scenario that there are several countries we could name in which turnout is very low year to year. Now, I want to close by just saying that it is obviously not the role or the mandate of the Election Commission to change people's attitudes towards Parliament, towards national government. Right? The IEC is a non-partisan institution, and it would not be their place to campaign for or against democratic institutions. But it is very important that we as a nation come together around strong civic messaging. So I will close there. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sorry that it is my voice that is standing between you and tea time. So I will thank you very much and conclude here today. Looking forward to engagements later today. Thank you again.
I was worried, Dr. Gordon, that you were going to release people to tea yourself, which would have been an effective coup d'etat to my duties. So I was listening very carefully to your conclusion remarks. Colleagues, I saw some of you trying very hard with your cell phones. You had to even delete some photos so that you could take photos of the slides as they appeared. I am sure that the presentation will be made available to us. Much of it is in the report. So at least you can do that, Dr. Roberts. Just the presentation itself, the way it was packaged, if attendees could get it. But very sobering insights there. I don't know why the politicians are still smiling, because I think from that report, I see the fighters are here as well. From that report, we should be asking them to excuse us, because they are untrustworthy people. But it's true, they don't even trust each other. They give each other lie detector tests. There's a problem in that industry, colleagues, and we need to fix it. There's something not right. You know, if your own say, I have a lie detector test and I don't trust. And so this is why today when we do Q&A, I will try not give people numbers, lest the IEC say, I am adopting a strategy from elsewhere of assigning numbers to people for the wrong reasons. But I'm raising these as just pure demonstration as to why there's this crisis that the HSRC is talking about. The behavior of political parties is clownish, uninspiring. It puts off people. And they have to have conversations with themselves on how to just behave better. Because it's not an IEC problem, as you say, Dr. Gordon. The IEC can provide the platform, the party liaison committees, and all of these other things, but they have to behave better. And we must tell them in their presence. We must not private them. Because Bamosha, right? Bamosha. We must tell them. And they know most. I'm not scared of any of them. I've been telling them the truth for over a decade now. But they are hard to listen. Oh, they are hard to listen. It's like the more you tell them, the more you fuel them to do the wrong thing. Currency wrongness seems to increase for them. But we need to continuously tell them, because, colleagues, this democracy, and our lives in general, as I always say to my colleague Tessa, that even whether you are smiling or not is a political issue. And that's why there's a Minister of Happiness in the United Arab Emirates. That's why there is a Minister of Loneliness in Japan who was appointed during COVID. Because progressive countries understand that the person is political, the personal is political. Here we are still fighting for electricity, Minister of Electricity. Other countries are fighting for happiness. How nice is that? How beautiful is that? Nice life problems. Eh? Other countries are fighting whether their phones must function on Android or not. You know, we're still talking about pit latrines. Whether kids get to fall in there or they are dumped there, but the fact that it's those are our struggles. When you gaze around, I mean, got to London last year in September. They are already fueling their buses with green hydrogen. Eh? Eh? Green hydrogen. Here, you still can't take public transport after 6 p.m. And anyway, 67% of the commuters are on what is dubbed public transport, which is private transport, taxis. Taxis are not public transport. This thing that we talk about, any taxi, that's not public, that's private transport run by violence and fear and criminality. Anyway, let's go to tea. Let's come back here. It's not going to be 30 minutes, colleagues. Let's come back here at 11:45. I will drag each and every one of you, but let's take some tea. I also want to greet the politicians and hear what they are going to say to me as a commitment that I can report after tea break. Uguti, how are they going to check themselves? Check yourself. Thank you. to do is I'm going to kick us off so that they realize the seriousness of my dictatorship. You see, you can't be a dictator and then be soft. You are going to lose power. You know, this sentiment that people have as partly an outcome of the HSRC, and of course, I think the African Barometer survey also indicated this. People talk about this Paul Kagame they are looking for in South Africa. And it's nice, ne? They flirt with the idea of this dictator. They even romanticize him and they call him a benevolent dictator. But people are dying at Michelangelo from Rwanda. Risks. And we need to really educate society about how hard it was to get this democracy. But what is the value of this democracy? Because if we continue to erode this value of democracy, we're going to end up with more and more of these calls of a Paul Kagame. And guess what? You will get one. If you're not careful, you will get a Paul Kagame. And Mnage, because guys, I must be honest, the time is soft life, mean. So if there were to be a dictatorship here, I am leaving. I'll go stay overseas. One thing I've said to people, there is absolutely no way I'm going to the bush. Our grandfathers did that. Now our duty is to protect this democracy. People talk of a revolution. So when I used to be on radio, people would call in and say, yeah, we must start a revolution. I'm not ready to have an AK-47 sleep behind trees next to lions because I'm in a revolution. No, thank you. I will do whatever. I think the democratic space presents us with so many opportunities to be active, but to protect this democracy. And deal with these notions of a Paul Kagame. I mean, there are no elections in Rwanda, okay? Opposition is jailed at the mercy of the president. I know he has these cosmetic things that he does. Women representation in parliament looks quite progressive, blah, blah. But when it comes to crunch time, if you are his opponent, you must be jailed. Imagine, if we had a Paul Kagame, now I'd probably be doing 20 years by now. Because I'd be seen as the enemy of the state. You get a Uganda, right? Everybody's kicking and screaming about them passing anti-gay laws. But that's what you get when you have a dictator. Those are the things that erode. So I think this insight of an appetite for a more authoritarian regime is something that we need to deal with seriously, colleagues. In the churches, Bomuruti, Pastor Mlambo, I met you during tea. Where is Pastor Mlambo? Oh, he's late. But I wanted to say to him, when he prays there at church, he must tell his congregants, Baratua, democracy, kiyona tsila. This dictatorship must only end here in the church. You know most how churches are. The reverend is everything. Anyway, let me not upset reverends. Let me call dear and fellow troublemakers who spend their time trying to help shape the public discourse. I hope they are not into propaganda, but they help shape public discourse. I see them on TV, I hear them on radio. I'm just privileged to know all of them in different ways. But today they are going to have about an hour, not to themselves, colleagues, please. And when I stay, you've had your hours already this week, because we were at the Nelson Mandela Foundation yesterday with you. So 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and then let's give these beautiful people an opportunity to share. But when we share, colleagues, we must make commitments. Okay? What are we going to go and do? Obabu said, the moral regeneration movement are grappling with these issues. What are we going to do to what I call enthuse people again about democracy? Enthuse people, inspire them, and also talk of democracy beyond political parties. Okay? Beyond the vote. I went to a public participation meeting back in my hometown in Flagstaff 2 weeks back. So they asked me to go there. You can't say no to home. It was a nice excuse to see my grandmother after her 92nd birthday. So I went there 2 weeks back, and I asked people, I said, do you know that you can attend a council meeting? And they said, no, we didn't. And I say, well, it's worse in the rural municipalities, because when they build the council chamber, they make sure that the last seat of the councillor is at the door. So that, therefore, there can be no public gallery. But try attend a council meeting here in the city of Joburg. Hey, the politicians will give you hoops and loops. You must be invited. Yeah? Who would invite so critical a person who is not there to just listen, but may tell the public, council. Also now it's unattractive. Some of these council meetings end at 12 a.m. icon. But there are certain things that we must talk about in bolstering this democracy. And even ask ourselves, are we doing enough? Are we going to the council meetings? Are we attending? Are we helping people understand that? Are we fighting for ease of attendance? I mean, in the council, in the municipality of the city of eThekwini, they even tried to ban journalists from council meetings. And there had to be a fight about it. Because for some strange reason, there is an entitlement that once elected into office, this democracy is yours. Icon. Anyway, I'm not asked to do that. There are capable people here. Professor Dek Kotze is here, very capable. Professor of Political Sciences with the University of South Africa. Dr. Stembile Mbete is here. You see, I'm talking about PhD people. Now we must have limited opinions, and because we don't have these PhDs. Dr. Stembile Mbete, who's at the University of Pretoria on sabbatical currently, and with Future Elect as part of their program team. Ibrahim Fakir, he's from ASRI. See, this is where abbreviations help. He's from ASRI. What does ASRI mean? It's something Socio-Economic Rights Institute. I never know whether it's AWAL, it depends where you are. Tessa Dooms, who's a director at the Rivonia Circle, and my colleague at work. They are the 4 panelists who are going to come up now and sit nicely here. I mean, Ibrahim even is wearing an under badge. So it would be a mistake if I didn't say he must come and sit here. He said, he said, well, you must have swag at least. Yes, you are coming. Please, colleagues, come. Now, because there's 4 of you, and you are a panel, and there are only 4 seats, and I don't have a seat, so I'm going to stand here and ask each one of you to say something. Then I'll try moderate you. I see here they say discussions, Q&A, facilitated by HSRC and panelists. No, colleagues. I'm going to exercise my authoritarian regime. I am going to moderate and facilitate the discussion. Don't worry. I am here. I am not rushing anywhere, not going anywhere. I am here until lunchtime. But what we'll also do as you give your remarks If then there are questions that are directed particularly to the HSRC, we'll give the colleagues that made the presentation an opportunity to respond. They will choose a spokesperson. They will not respond in the way that they presented, one after the other, all four of them. They're going to choose a spokesperson. Where do I start? Ibrahim, let me abuse you. Because you've been doing this business around elections. You are even called the friend of the IEC. You should be worried. They are trying to neutralize you. Once they make you a friend, they are co-opting you, friend of the IEC. Be very worried. Because now they are starting to switch down your voice. But I mean, there are a number of insights that have come from this report. There is important work that has to be done around democracy, whether we are talking about the electoral system, whether we're talking about participation. But what I do want to hear from all of you colleagues, really, starting with you, Ibrahim, is this declining participation is a serious issue. If you look at 2021, 12 million of 26 million registered voters voted. 12 million of 40 million eligible voters voted. You have 14 million people who are just not even bothered to register to vote, okay? Voter turnout is one thing, but the participation rate is another altogether. So you can say your voter turnout is 42%, but actually that figure goes far below if you look at participation rates. So what needs to be done? I'm not being Leninist on you, but what must be done?
Thank you, Chair. And since seeing they've all had their hour, I can take the whole hour.
You can speak on their behalf.
Thanks. Thanks also for noticing that I dressed up. I dressed up especially, largely because if you don't have the substance, you must at least opt for style. And I think you've touched, now to be serious for a moment, congratulations to the HSRC and especially to the IEC for taking this kind of objective research very seriously. We all take it very seriously. I have taken it seriously over the years. And though I'm a friend of the IEC, I'm getting increasingly worried about being claimed as a friend, because the IEC's level of trust and credibility was second only to the Constitutional Court until now. So the highest levels of trust and confidence that South Africans have is firstly in the Constitutional Court and second in the IEC. I think they deserve a round of applause. But worryingly, and not to detract from the findings of the Human Sciences Research Council, there's another widespread, relatively robust survey from the Afrobarometer, which shows that until 2019, more than 2/3 of South Africans trusted the IEC. But in 2021, this is 2 years after the last national provincial elections, that factor has gone down to 1/3. That's pretty serious. And so henceforth, I'm no longer a friend of the IEC. So I think there are real problems in the administration and management of the electoral process, and we mustn't run away from that. But the real problem, friends, is not trust and credibility in the IEC. It's trust and credibility, Lukhona, in your favorite stakeholders, political parties. 26% for the governing party and 24% for opposition parties. That's pretty low. That's less than 1/3 of South Africans who have no trust. That means more than 2/3 of South Africans have absolutely no trust and confidence in political parties. So perhaps they need to take a long, hard look at themselves, because there's not just a crisis of credibility that political parties as organizations themselves have. The fact of the matter is they inhabit public institutions, and they take the rot that animates political parties into public institutions. And so the credibility of public institutions has been declining quite significantly, which I ultimately answer your question. It's a bit late, but I'm always late. And so the answer to your question is that the rates of participation are directly correlated to a lack of trust and credibility in public institutions, not in the IEC and not in the electoral process. So there's very little that the IEC can do, notwithstanding the useful information that the HSRC has found into how there may be better satisfaction in the electoral process, in the management and administration of it. That's not going to increase levels of participation exponentially. It is the performance of public institutions and the performance of government in particular which will drive up rates of participation. So I think we must make no bones about the fact that low rates of participation have very little to do with the weather, with the day of the week on which the election is held, on the fact that we have too many elections separated. Every 2.5 years we have an election, which to me is quite important. So those factors are not what drives participation down, nor is the fact that as societies mature and move further away from their point of transition or democratization, rates of participation will naturally decline. Of course, that's a phenomenon across the world, but the cataclysmic decline of participation in South Africa is largely because of the credibility of government and the credibility of public institutions. The way in which opposition parties behave in these institutions is similarly racked with a lack of confidence in the same way that the governing or the majority party is. Now, opposition parties and the governing party are viewed by most South Africans as insular, as parochial, and as self-interested. So if you look at the survey data, a lot of the survey data tells you that this is how the public perceives political parties. And this crisis of credibility, if it's prolonged over a long period of time, actually leads to a legitimation crisis. And a legitimation crisis is something any democratic government cannot face. I know that my 5 minutes are coming up. In my case, each minute is made up of 90 seconds, not 60. So I want to say two last things. South Africa's problem is not democracy. There are problems in democracy. There are incipient problems in the way in which we have practices of democracy in as a society. Freedom of speech, the exercise of rights, the ability to contribute to public debate, the ability to exercise voice and choice, those are relatively robust. Notwithstanding the fact that we do have problems with surveillance technology, with the clampdown on social movement, on protest activity and so on. That aside, those incipient problems aside, our problems are not a problem of democracy. Our problems are the performance of democratic government. And they're two separate things. And when I talk about democratic government, I'm talking about the restraints on authority, the abuse of executive office, the ability to manipulate institutions, processes and procedures in institutions. Those are our problems. And again, that's not a problem of society. That's a problem of political parties. They inhabit those public institutions, not us. That's the second last point. The very last point, and I promise this is where I'll end. I want to focus on two F's, and no, they are not swear words. The first is that we must maintain a focus on the question of free and fair elections. I know our colleagues at the HSRC have embarked on this new exciting measure of electoral integrity, which is quite important. But you know, the question of electoral integrity is like ethics. You can have more or you can have less of it. Whereas the question of measuring elections as free and fair have fundamental criteria which have to be satisfied. And I think as a society, we must resist what has happened across the rest of the continent, where a judgment on the election moves away from it being as free and fair to it reflected the will of those who participated. And then it gets even narrower, and it becomes, it reflects the will of those who voted. But those who voted are people who are dead, people who are under 18, people who shouldn't be on the voters' roll, they also voted in some countries, especially to the north of our border. We have to resist that. That's the first F I wanted to focus on. The second F I wanted to focus on is a more important and prosaic one at the same time, is the level of funding that the IEC has received. And this is important for two reasons. A, it has operational limits on what the IEC can do in terms of outreach, in terms of public education, civic education, but also logistical preparation and so on. And there is a very sinister motive that lurks behind this lack of funding, because it sets the IEC up for failure. And political parties to return to these negative creatures that animate our public life. They are famous as externalizing their problems onto everyone else. And so they will blame the IEC for all kinds of problems. And for those of us who are interested in maintaining the robustness of our electoral process and our electoral democracy, must resist the temptation to fall into the lap of what the political parties are used to doing, and that is to blame the IEC. Where there is a real problem of administration, of logistics, of fiddling with the electoral process, of course we must call it out, and we all have. But the deliberate externalizing of the problems of political parties to that of the IEC and of the manager of the electoral process must be resisted. My final point, it's not just the credibility of the electoral process, it's the credibility of the participants in that process, the political parties. The elections are not about parties, they're about voters. And parties have to stop thinking that the elections are about them. They are mere contestants. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. You are reminding me of someone who, when they started a meeting, they said, colleagues, we must just be mindful that time is a social construct. and I knew then that, oh, this meeting is going to derail. So Ibrahim has made time a social construct with his 90 seconds per minute. Dr. Mbete, I mean, some reflections, very rich data that is coming through. It seems to, resonate with a number of other, data sets. There's work that we are going to publish that we've been to 13 different towns across 7 provinces doing focus groups just this year on democracy and people's perception of the country. Things are quite dire, and I know sometimes people may feel that we are unnecessarily attacking political parties, but there's really a crisis in South Africa, isn't there?
Yes, there is, and I actually think that we haven't attacked political parties enough. Our focus so much over the last few years has been on individuals, so whether it's this president, or it's this public protector, or that one, or this mayor, or that mayor, but we haven't really interrogated the institutional unit of the political party, because political parties are the base unit of our democratic system. And many of the issues that we have in terms of accountability, in terms of ethics and integrity, actually stem from dysfunction within political parties. And so I think that something that I would hope comes from this research, and as we reflect towards 2024, is to really interrogate our parties and hold parties and party leaders accountable for the way in which they operate. I think, Ibrahim, you would have been at IDASA at the time, about maybe 15 years ago, conducted some research into political parties' internal ethics processes. And something that came out of that research was how few, firstly, political parties at the time were willing to talk to researchers about what their internal ethics processes were, but secondly, how inconsistently those processes were applied within the parties. And yet we expect those same people from the same parties to then behave according to a particular code of ethics once they are parliamentarians or once they are in the executive of government at different levels. And so I think something that has been really